Good evening, everyone. My name is Natalie Turvey, and I'm President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. Welcome to the season finale of our CJF J-Talk series. You made a great choice, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge our audience tonight. It is a rainy night, it is a big hockey night, and you have turned up here tonight because you care about the future of journalism in Canada, and we are grateful to have you with us. Tonight, we are diving headfirst into the world of broadcast news with the news leaders shaping its future. Just days after our federal election, we are tackling a pressing question. How is broadcast news reinventing itself and staying relevant in today's fractured media environment? Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the land where we gather tonight. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and come together in these territories. A special CJF thank you to our exclusive J-Talk series sponsor, TD Bank Group, for making this conversation and an entire season of vital conversations possible. We are already busy at the CJF planning an exciting lineup of in-person and virtual talks that will kick off in the fall. To stay connected, you can follow us on social media, visit our website, or sign up for our newsletter. Tonight's program will run for about 70 minutes, and we want to hear from you. If you have a question for the panel, just write it on one of these question cards provided, and our team will collect them throughout the evening. At the CJF, we have a guiding principle. We believe as journalism goes, so goes democracy. And that's why this conversation in this post-election period couldn't be more timely. As we mark the CJF's 35th anniversary this year, it's a powerful reminder of our ongoing commitment to championing journalism that strengthens our democracy. As we look ahead, we also need to face the challenges right in front of us. The media landscape today is more fragmented than ever. Trust is fragile. Audiences, especially younger ones, are shifting to podcasts, streaming services, and social media. And according to the 2024 Digital News Report by Reuters, nearly a quarter of Canadians get their news from social media. And a recent US Pew Research study found that a striking 37% of Gen Z and millennials now regularly get their news from social media news influencers rather than traditional sources. Traditional newsrooms are being challenged to meet people where they are while holding on to the principles that define quality journalism. So what role should broadcasters play in shaping an informed public, and how can digital platforms and new distribution channels be leveraged for audience engagement without sacrificing journalistic integrity? We are fortunate to have an exceptional group of news leaders here tonight to unpack these challenges, and I'm delighted to introduce them. First, we have Brodie Fenlon, a valued CJF board member, but more importantly, general manager and editor-in-chief of CBC News, where he steers the ship of Canada's national public broadcasters, English language news and current affairs. Joining him is Richard Gray, Vice President of CTV News and a driving force in one of Canada's leading private broadcasters. We also welcome Sonia Verma, the groundbreaking first ever editor-in-chief at Global News, shaping the digital future of its online platform, globalnews.ca. And rounding out our panel is Jonathan Whitten, a veteran news leader and news director at CityNews Toronto, a vital voice within the Rogers Network, who navigates the complexities of local news right here in Toronto. Guiding this conversation is our insightful, award-winning moderator, Nam Kiwanuka, who brings her wealth of experience and thoughtful interview style to our discussion tonight. On behalf of the CJF and the entire audience, we are honored to have you with us. Nam, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I am also very excited to learn from the four of you. We're going to be talking about some of the points that Natalie brought up: news influencers, social media, local news, the election. But I thought we would, start with something a little fun. How many of you have watched a movie or a TV show where the protagonist is maybe a journalist? It happens a lot, right? And it's very glamorous, I think. Sometimes I'm like, I don't know if that's been my experience. But from the newsroom, the morning show, characters like Carrie Bradshaw from Sex and the City, Peter Parker in Spider-Man, and Clark Kent in Superman, to movies like Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, one of my favorites. Don't judge me. Spotlight, All the President's Men, Citizen Kane, and Bridget Jones's Diary. Hollywood seems to have a thing for journalism. So I'd like to know from the four of you, what does Hollywood get right and wrong about journalism? And what is your favorite journalism movie or show? Brodie, I'll start with you.
Okay, I'm going to pick one that's not an obvious, because I love Spotlight and I love All the President's Men, but I love a show called W1A, and it is it's not a...
BBC?
It's a BBC show. It's actually on CBC Gem right now if you want to stream it for free. And but it's if you haven't seen it, it's set in the BBC. It's about the BBC, and it's skewering satire about the running of a public broadcaster. And the first time I watched it, I had to stop. It got a little too uncomfortably too real. But it's a great take on some of the complexities of trying to run a public media organization and a newsroom. There's a scene that I love where these department heads are sitting around a table, and they're really seized with another BBC crisis. Something has come out in the public about a host, and the head of news says, "Where did this story come from?" And his colleagues are like, "It's from your news department. It's your own journalist who broke this story." That rings true to me.
You've experienced. You can share with us the story if you want. Safe space.
No, just the fact that at least at CBC, I've worked at a number of news organizations, but you have a really fiercely independent news service of journalists who actually will turn their journalism on the organization as well as any other place and report on ourselves, which is always uncomfortable, but also kind of great that it's you have a news service that's independent of even itself.
And Richard, what about you?
Very similar to what Brodie has just said. I don't like anything that is too real because it seems more like a day at the office.
It's more like a documentary.
It's more like being at work. I got one episode into the morning show and couldn't watch any more of it. I said to my wife, "I live this every day. You can watch this all the way to the end. I'm not watching any more of it." Probably my favorite was The Newsroom, though I must admit, and I'm going to show my age here, a CTV program called ENG from the late 70s, early 80s was really a favorite as well.
Anyone watch the morning show, since you mentioned it? Can I give us some spoil? Well, then there's actually an episode in the morning show, I'm sorry if I'm spoiling it for anybody, but it's been out for a while, where a journalist goes into space who's dating like a billionaire. So when all that stuff with Katy Perry and Gayle King happened, I was like, oh my God, did they watch the morning show? Is that where they got it from? Anyway, Sonia, what about you?
Well, it's my favorite, and I know that some of my colleagues here find it triggering, but it makes me feel less lonely. And I also think that it's wonderful to see what one would aspire to in terms of the glamour, the jets, the private tours of outer space that certain journalists are afforded. So yeah, that one's actually my favorite, and I binge watch that one for sure.
What do you think journalism, movies, and TV get wrong about journalism?
Oh, probably most things. I think that. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think that we all sort of probably look a lot more tired than many of the people who are in the shows. I think that I think that we certainly, I don't know that we all dress quite as well as some of the characters in the shows. I think, though, that some of the core principles really resonate, and some of the core storylines really resonate. In the morning show, the network is really struggling with social media, and influencers, and sort of how that sometimes displaces news in certain situations. I think some of the characters, are interesting and probably inspired, shall we say, by true events. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I used to be a videographer, so I was a camera person before I started interviewing. And the thing that gets me is the technical stuff. Or if they're holding the camera, I'm like, that's not how you hold a camera. Or if the mic, it's like, that mic is not on. But John, what about you?
Because the only thing I like more than television news is public speaking, I wanted to tip my hat to a great scene in a movie called Broadcast News, which people might remember.
Right,
which
yes.
And specifically Albert Brooks, who's thrown in at the last minute reading the network news and ends up with sweat, just a shirt with sweat all the way through it and rolling down his face, and it's a great scene. It rings a little bit true for some people. I also, and it's not surprising, I kind of thought Brodie might mention W1A. We used to use it as therapy when we were working together. But my favorite scene is where the news director, who's spot on, right, in terms of how he's just always under the gun and always under pressure and always losing his mind, is forced to issue a broadcast apology for an earlier broadcast apology. And I've done that. I think most of us have done it. And the apology for the apology is the epitome of broadcast television news. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I am going to talk a little bit about you are leaders in the newsroom, and with that comes a great amount of responsibility. So we're going to touch on that in just a moment. But it's been a few days since the federal election. And the good news is that voter turnout was almost historical, with some 68.7% of eligible voters casting a ballot, which translates to more than 19.5 million Canadians. The record was set in March 1958 with 79.4% turnout. But the road to this turnout was littered with distrust of legacy media, misinformation and disinformation on social media, and the threat of President Trump annexing Canada. Bearing all of that, how did your newsrooms approach how you would cover the election? John, I'll start with you.
Well, it was the first time that we had done an election, at least for a little while, with 3 all-news channels across the country. So we were able to do a lot of live news conferences in their entirety through the day. And I think that's important. So there was less packaging and less taking bits and pieces here and there and putting it into a story, and less reliance on picking what we think is important, and more just putting out there the actual full news conference. So I think that was helpful. Otherwise, it was a short campaign. There were logistical challenges in covering it. When I did my first and last campaign in 1993, there were 5 of us from one network on the plane, right? There was a producer, myself, a reporter, camera, sound, and an editor, only for one network television outlet. Things are so different now. It's all pooled for the most part. We add in cameras and add in support where we can. So it's a different kind of a game now.
So how do you make yourself stand out? Because behind the scenes, things have changed. You basically have to create more with less, because you have multiple platforms. You've got social media, you have digital platforms, you also have broadcasts, you have radio. So how do you make yourselves stand out from other networks?
Through not just covering the campaigns, by also doing in-depth stories on issues that matter to people, I think is an important part of it. It's trying to find that mix between wanting to be on the story of the day and wanting to make sure we're covering news and that we're relevant and we're on the same planet as everybody, but also finding time in our coverage to also look at important issues, whether it's tariffs, the obvious one, but housing, cost of living, and other things. So it's that trying to find that mix in the coverage, I think, is the best way to do it.
And Sonia?
I think that, as John alluded to, I think there were some particular challenges this time that we all faced. One of the things that's very important is for us to be able to cover, all of the campaigns. And unfortunately, the Conservative Party did ban media from its plane, which made it, I think, a little bit challenging for us. I think as a group to have the same kind of coverage as we had previously. I think that we managed. We were very committed to still covering that campaign, and just ended up having to sort of hopscotch people, frankly, across the country in order to make sure that we were at all of the press conferences, and answering the questions. I think a frustration of mine is sometimes not having as much access to all of the leaders as we would like as journalists, not having the chance to ask the questions that I think are important. At Global News, we tried to take a very, I think, rigorous and I think a terrific approach to our coverage across the board. We did special editions of Global National out of some really interesting places. We did a show out of Whitehorse. I thought that it was really interesting to capture what's going on in the north of this country, where the stakes, I think, are particularly high, which is a place where we tend not to get to as much as I think we should, especially now. So those are the things that I think sort of stood out. But in other ways, I think that it's about sticking to what's tried and true. We have a great team at Global News. Anchoring the show, Donna Friesen, we had Eric Sorensen, we had David Aiken on his magic boards explaining what was happening. We had a terrific political panel that Mercedes Stevenson, the host of the West Block, was managing. So, we tried to include all of the different perspectives, I think, of the different campaigns, but also to try to get to those different parts of the country that Jonathan alluded to.
I had a follow-up, and everybody else can add on to it, but you mentioned that because you didn't have the same access to the leaders, I think for example, the Liberal leader gave, both the Liberal leader and the Conservative leader, they gave interviews to non-journalists, and they gave super long interviews, maybe an hour and a half, and you didn't have the same access to the Conservative candidates this way that you would. We're dealing with mistrust of the media. We're also dealing with independent media that might not have the same rules. They might not have to play by the same rules as journalists do. So how do you approach that when you're trying to cover a pivotal election while managing the stuff behind the scenes that the public might not know or understand is going on?
Sure, I'll take a shot at that one first. It is a real challenge, and it was certainly a frustration in our newsroom at CTV. You saw Canadian politicians spend more time on American airwaves leading up to and during this campaign than you saw, on any of our properties, doing specific interviews. Those politicians still had no issue or problem doing live news conferences and expecting us to cover them throughout the campaign, which we all did. But yeah, it is a challenge, and I think it is going to be a challenge that's going to exist long after this election is over. I don't think we can count on political leaders in this country naturally going to mainstream media to get their message out on our terms. I think they will continue to do it on their terms. Look no further than the proliferation of political party advertising that appeared in all of our newscasts and on all of our news services. They certainly recognized and acknowledged from an advertising purchase standpoint where the audience was. They didn't recognize and acknowledge it when it came to making time to talk to our journalists. And I think a lot of that has to do with a desire, and this is a very, very big change, a desire to avoid having to address tough questions. I know in our case, where we did see a major political party leader willing to do an interview was in some of our smaller market stations. Here in Toronto, they would often visit CP24, but they would not talk to our seasoned political journalists.
Yeah, and I think the truth is there's not much that we can do about that, actually. We can try to make sure, because I think that happens across the board, Richard. We saw all of the leaders, I think, in the last days of the campaign, doing interviews with some of our local reporters who were very good, I might add, in Vancouver. And what we try to do is to coordinate as a news organization to make sure that the questions that are put to the leaders really reflect the questions that the news organization want to handle. But there was a time that we would have those interviews done with, our chief anchor or our chief political correspondent. And I think, to Richard's point, those interviews aren't being granted, and that frustration of seeing leaders on, CNN or American networks is something that I think is of concern, because these are people who would like to lead this country. And I think it's important to, just as they're talking about the importance of buying Canadian and supporting Canada, well, let's speak to our Canadian audiences through our Canadian news networks.
I just want to add one more thing. I've always been of the mind that nobody's obligated to speak to us, but they should want to. They really should want to. That is, I think, the one of the cornerstones of a democracy. Political leaders should be willing to engage with anyone at any moment in time about any subject, including seasoned political journalists, including mainstream media. You don't get to just pick and choose.
I want to hear from Brodie, but I just wanted to do another follow-up, because I think from the conversations that I'm having with my colleagues and the conversations that I'm seeing online is that there's this kind of anger, disillusionment, frustration towards the media, in the sense that people think that, the media should be the ones holding these guys to account. And if the politicians are circumventing that and going to friendlier, outlets, can you boycott? Because I think there's a belief that maybe the media can collectively boycott. How do you push back and maybe say that we are trying, but you can't, these guys are kind of doing what they want to do?
I think Richard made the point. Ultimately, it's up to them. I think, I've been through a lot of debates in newsrooms about how much we cover in terms of the difficulty we're having in covering a story and the difficulty we're having in talking to people. And there's always, not always, but often a push from journalists if we're excluded from photo ops and only given official photos that we boycott. I mean, it's an open question, there's no right answer, but I think that that's just not the right way to go. At the end of the day, our job is to do what we can, do everything we can, find interesting ways, innovative ways to work around the restrictions that we've been given. Obviously complain about it and make the case, but not to back away from it and not do it as some kind of a fight, because we'd just be giving up our obligation to be covering the election.
But I think, to be clear, I'm thinking collectively, millions of Canadians are watching our newscasts every night. And so I think that, I feel that we are doing our jobs. I feel that I don't see, at Global anyway, I don't see people tuning out. I feel that this election, I think that part of the reason that there was such a big turnout, I mean, there's probably many, but I like to think that media did play an important role in that. And so I'm not willing to concede the point that, people aren't watching us, that we're not doing our jobs, that we're not holding people to account. I think that journalists at all of our networks do that every day. They work very, very hard at that. And, it's why we're all here. So I don't feel like we've given up, or that, it's a lost cause by any means.
Well, millions of Canadians tuned into the debates. I think they set records. Sorry, John, did you want to say something?
No, it's fine.
And I think with CBC, you also had record numbers. Brodie, how did you approach covering the election?
Well, yeah, the interest in the election was huge and intense, and throughout the whole campaign. And then, you always, when you go into an election, you always have these competing interests of the horse race, and then how do you tell the story of what people actually care about and want to talk about? And that became even trickier in this election, because the horse race was so interesting in terms of how the polling had changed. So, the newsrooms were easily gravitate to that story because it was a fascinating story, but you had to work pretty hard to make sure, and we tried and did some interesting things about getting out of Ottawa and getting out of polling and into communities, and we did a number of things, including what we called What Matters, which was going into really small communities that we don't go into, and listening and talking to people, and then yes, creating some content out of it, but more the act of listening to find out what was really of interest to people on the ground where they lived. I think, for CBC, obviously the other elephant in the room was that we were part of the
story.
The part of the story. That was probably one of the trickiest things for us, because the worst thing for a news organization is to be kind of a wedge issue in an election. And so we went into, that was my first preoccupation, was how do we manage that and live up to our standards when there's an inherent conflict of interest in covering it. And so we kind of set the table with all of our teams and our staff about this. We will cover this issue like we would any other Crown Corporation, and do the best about kind of parking our self-interest and cover it. But that wasn't easy.
So you had the conversation with your staff saying that we are part of the story, but we have to do this.
Yeah, very much so. And, of course, there were interesting campaigns on all sides happening around us. And, it was really important that we, on the journalism side, did not engage, did not get involved. But so that was that made it a little more difficult. I'm proud of our teams. They kept their heads down and just did the job. To the earlier discussion about, it is true, and it will forever be true going forward. Politicians are going to try to work around the media. They've actually used that language. How do we? I think there was a fundraising letter in Nova Scotia where the party said, give us money so we can work around the media. And today the White House has launched their own news website, which will favor friendly coverage. So this is going to be our reality going forward. And I think the answer to that is just double down on uncovering them as best you can. And when they go on Jordan Peterson or a Prof G and do an hour and a half interview, we should be paying attention to that, reporting on it, and providing all of the context and the fact checks. And to Sonia's point, despite the fact that they're trying to work around us, huge audiences are coming to us because I think the audiences are smart, and they know, many of them know, that what they're getting in that podcast is going to be very different from what they're getting from us, which is kind of fact-based, impartial journalism.
Well, if you can't control the politicians, the other part of that equation is the public. Do you talk about building trust with the audience? Also, even trying to get people on side who are maybe entrenched in their positions?
Let me take that one first, because I think there's a very key and important point to make here. And that is, those that don't trust us are loud, and those that do trust us are quiet. We are not mistrusted to the extent that I believe is talked about, and certainly we have recently done research that reinforces that point of view. We recently did research across the country. Earlier this year, we interviewed 2,000 news consumers between the ages of 18 and 64 across multiple markets from coast to coast. And every mainstream media type, so broadcast television, radio news, newspaper, scored roughly an 80 with respect to trust. Social media scored a 50. So this narrative that there's a great deal of mistrust out there in the mainstream media, I think it's simply that. It is an argument of convenience for a very small and loud group of people. Now, all that said, we do need to be cognizant. I think all of us would prefer that number to be 100. And I think we should constantly be aspiring for that number to be 100 with respect to our trust rating. But I don't think that this is as big an issue as it is made out to be. As I said, it's a narrative that is created with a specific purpose in mind.
To divide?
To divide, yeah.
I mean, sure. Those sound high. I don't know what the methodology was. I've never seen numbers in the 80s. But again, it depends what you ask and how you ask and who you ask. I'd be surprised if the numbers are 80 if you're under 55. I mean, that seems to be a sliding scale, right? The 25 to 34. Trust is low. They're not getting their news from the people up the front in the front row here. As you move up, for sure, the numbers are higher. But 80 does seem high, and it's and our audiences are shrinking. So regardless of where that number is, that's something we have to contend with and figure. I don't know if there's an answer to it, but I would just say that I do think it's a bigger problem than maybe Richard had, in the way that Richard looks at it.
I think it's, the question is an interesting one. But I also think that I don't spend my time worrying about how I'm going to convince people that I don't think I'm probably going to convince at the end of the day to watch our newscast or to consume our journalistic content. I worry about making sure that that we as news leaders trust ourselves, that we trust our journalists, that we trust the facts, that we trust our staff to assign well, to cover the news properly. And those are the things that I feel that we can control. And I think that, for us anyway, I mean, we have record audiences. And I think that the work has to speak for itself. And I know that, and I don't mean to dismiss some of the important work that's been done around creating trust. I know that you guys are involved in the Trust Project, CBC, and I think that CBC's done some important work around this. But at the end of the day, I worry that energy is, you're preaching to the choir. And so, so from my perspective, it's more, I suppose it's more fruitful to just sort of focus on our own newsrooms.
Focus on the job and do it well?
Yeah.
As newsroom leaders, you shoulder a lot of responsibility, and there is, I'm guessing, there's very little room for error. When did you get it wrong, and how did you handle what came next?
I mean, we get it wrong a lot. Not in a big way necessarily. We started something recently on the website. Others may have it. I'm not sure. People can send in corrections, and we get a lot, right? And it's typos and it's things like that. So it happens a lot. On more serious things, it's apologize early and often, and as widely as is necessary from where the mistake was made. So that's important. Is to always correct and always be transparent about mistakes that you made and own up for them. It's really important. Specifically, where we got it wrong, this might be a little bit in left field. Occurred to me last week looking at some of the some AI videos. We spent, collectively, a lot of time over the last 7 years talking about the dangers of AI to disinformation in the news space, and how when that AI became as good as it is now, this was 5 years ago, it was going to just be a disaster, and no one was going to know what they were looking at, whether it was real or not. Well, we're here now, and we kind of got that wrong.
Really, I feel like some stuff I try to triple check things, but there's been two times I'm like, this is something, but it's AI.
It's possible for sure, but the Pope hugging Lady Diana, and Trump fist fighting with Zelensky in the White House. These are they're more adjacent content now, as opposed to the worries that we would have had a few years ago that people were going to watch that and go, "My God, I can't believe that happened." The real world is so ubiquitous in terms of social, and you can see things happening everywhere. So when someone creates something that's opposite of that, it just becomes almost a meme, not something to worry about.
Can I kind of push back a little bit on that?
Absolutely.
President Trump just did an interview where him and the reporter were going back and forth about a Photoshop picture.
Yes, I know that.
And he seemed to believe what he saw was what it was, but it was Photoshopped.
I thought about that in the context of this question. I think that's more of a different thing. That's that push, which to Sonia's point makes it kind of impossible to push back against people that believe certain things, because their strategy is just to say things over and over and over again until to the point where people just back down and believe them, or at least their base believes them. So I think that's what that was. But and that wasn't even AI. That was like a Photoshop type thing. But Photoshop. Yeah, that's just straight up lying and getting away with it. But yeah, no, that's one thing I think we got a little bit wrong, anyways.
Brodie, I don't want to bring it up, but cross country. Do you think you got that wrong?
Which
Cross country checkup.
Oh, great.
Do you want to tell the audience what happened?
Yeah, so this was a cross country checkup, which is a national call-in show hosted by Ian Hannah-Mansing on Sundays. It's the only big national call-in show of that nature, and they wanted to do a cross-border program where you could hear, where Americans and Canadians could talk to each other about this stuff that Trump was floating about the 51st state. I thought that was a great idea, actually. Let's stop hearing from Trump and let's hear what real Americans think about this and what do Canadians think about it, because we wanted to give voice to all of the concerns and angst. By the way, I don't create those programs, and I actually learned about this, became a controversy while I was on vacation, and then I had to figure out how we're going to answer for it, which is, yeah, that's the W1A experience for me. But
damage limitation.
Right. Yeah. But the way it was framed was the question was not great, and a lot of people took it to mean that we were legitimizing the idea of a 51st state and let's have a conversation about it, which was really not the intent. And a huge letter writing campaign ensued before, and people were calling for people to be fired, including me, before it had even aired. And then if you listen to the program, it was, I think, for most people, better than they feared. So yeah, lessons learned about nuance and framing, and about the idea of having a town hall and a conversation about this idea that is so appalling to so many Canadians. I don't think that was a mistake. And the job of news organizations and journalism isn't just to make everybody feel comfortable and pour a warm bath for Canadians. I mean, there are hard things in the world, and for the public broadcaster, I think it's about creating a space where people can talk about it and hear each other out. I was just going to say, thinking about this question, this is not we got it wrong, but I think I've had some thoughts and reflections on the pandemic and learnings about, if you remember that time, especially the first year, where we were dealing with such unknowns, and journalism tends to defer, especially to expertise, especially around science and medicine. And I think we really did defer, rightly so, to those experts. But obviously, I think the takeaway is that science is like journalism. The story changes as new facts emerge. And I think in reflection, because if you remember, everything from how it was spread to, people were washing their groceries and, just take care of your hands, but don't worry about your breathing. And all that stuff evolved. And there was some real scientific consensus early on around certain facts that ended up changing. And I think we just have to be mindful about providing context that science evolves too, and what is fact, especially for something that's novel, like this pandemic was, you have to be careful about framing it as this is what we know now, these are the facts we understand, and these are what experts say, but it could change. So that was something I thought about.
I can't let this question go without admitting when we got it wrong, and we got it horribly wrong. And I think the audience is here for transparency. I ended up earlier this year in front of a House of Commons subcommittee, questioned extensively about a case where we made a egregious error. And as a news organization, we endeavored to own it and apologize for it as quickly as possible. we, as a news organization, followed up to ensure that, all facets of what it was that occurred were followed up on and appropriately investigated, and ultimately we made a decision to terminate 2 staff as a result of a real problematic manner in which we covered a story. And John talked about, in many cases, one apology is not enough. In our case, certainly we did 2, and then I don't know how many I did in front of the House of Commons subcommittee, probably 102, seemed like it. But it, I think it's critical when we do get it wrong, back to the trust question, to own it.
We actually, we're competitors, but spent a lot of time on that area. We changed our news policy. We did training around it. So caught me off guard too, and being around for a long time and kind of figuring out how that could happen, and realizing that we were all a little bit vulnerable to that happening again. So we do not only learn from our own mistakes, we learn from other people's mistakes, and we made a lot of changes around policy and practice, and did a lot of training around that too.
Sonia, did you want to?
Well, I was actually going to pick up on something that Brodie was talking about around the pandemic. Before this panel, I was chatting with my colleague, Jeff Semple, who's actually, and I promised him I would mention this, but he is writing a book called Fake News, which is to be released in the spring. And what he's doing is he's chronicling where disinformation sort of came from, kind of looking back at the last sort of 10 years. But interestingly, he was telling me that in Canada, the numbers and statistics that he's been reviewing, where it dropped off in Canada, in this country, was around the pandemic, which was very interesting for me. And, in the United States, when you look at some of these studies around trust in the media, it predates that. But I think there was something around the pandemic and the coverage of the pandemic, the conversation that maybe rattled people in terms of the way that the media was covering it and made them question that trust. So I just wanted to mention that, picking up on what you were saying.
I'm going to say something very provocative to expand on what you said, Sonia. I often say in our newsroom that the pandemic made us stupid and lazy. It was one story told one way for almost 3 years. And I continue to see I'm going to call it an erosion in what I'm going to say were well-entrenched journalistic practices pre-pandemic in a post-pandemic world, partly because of that, but also because of the massive amount of turnover that happened in our newsrooms during the pandemic. There was a huge exodus of experience, certainly at CTV, through the pandemic and after the pandemic. And it is a struggle for us every day as a result of that. Because, in combination with that happening, you have journalism schools, far fewer journalism programs and journalism schools than used to exist. The nature of training in journalism schools, I think, is very different than when any of us attended those programs. I look at what has happened to what I'm going to call our farm system, our developmental system. I began my career in television news in Timmins. I was one of 10 on-air staff in Timmins in 1991. We still operate that station. There's 2, and there's been 2 for probably the last 15 years. And that's one example of many. I continue to be very concerned that we are with little and no choice elevating people into major markets and into national news operations, and they don't have the depth and breadth of experience that they had in the past. And I worry about that. That concerns me in a very large way.
And if I could bring that back to the topic of trust, because trust is based on, a number of things, but one is not making mistakes, and that's a problem when you have a huge number of people leaving the business. Toronto's not bad, but outside of Toronto, it's hard to find people who are interested in journalism, and so you do have a lot of, as Richard said, a lot of young people. There's not as many people to vet. It's not as much stuff as before. That can lead to errors, and that's sort of a bit of a vicious circle in trust, because it is very much related to what Richard's talking about in terms of the hollowing out of the industry.
Well, Richard, you mentioned that even journalism schools, they're changing. We know in Toronto, some of the programs are not going to be around anymore because of funding. Layoffs are a thing. It just happens every single day. I'm curious to ask you all, because within your newsrooms, like Brodie, when the election started, your staffers, CBC was part of the story, and I'm sure at the back of their mind, they're thinking, if the election goes one way, this could happen we might lose our jobs, right? We don't know what's going to happen anyway, right? But that's what's out there, especially online. How do you keep up the morale in your newsrooms, and how do you address layoffs with your staff?
Well, I'll tie those two things back to the pandemic, because the pandemic and then this existential question about the CBC, which, by the way, I think was a really fair, it's a fair policy question. Should there be the CBC? I mean, I think that's a great, worthwhile debate. But in both cases, it's much trickier to cover a story that you are a part of. The pandemic was the first time where I saw everyone in the newsroom was covering something that they were also living. And so, in both cases, you're parking feelings that you're having, or worry or concern. People were getting sick, but also covering the story. I mean, it was a really interesting time. And I'll just add, by the way, other impacts of the pandemic on journalism, newsrooms that were suddenly working remotely, and a lot of learning happens in a newsroom, side by side with people doing the job. And people got very comfortable just doing interviews on computer and not leaving the newsroom. So, and when it comes to trust, again, I think trust is first and foremost built face-to-face when you're listening to somebody's story with genuine curiosity and taking it down or putting it into the mic and building a connection. So we lost that too. I don't think the pandemic helped at all in terms of building connection and trust with people on the ground. As for morale, and by the way, because this can sound morose, I mean, the job is incredible, and doing journalism is amazing. And when you get a chance to just leave the newsroom and just talk about what you do, it's pretty exciting. It's
a privilege. Really.
It's a privilege, and it's awesome, and I love it. And it's a hard business for sure. But we need to also talk with enthusiasm about what it is, because we do need more people to come into this profession, and we need those journalism schools to be recruiting lots of great students. For me, it's all about going back to it's a public service, and it's a mission-driven business, and if you care about helping people understand their world and what's happening, and there are moments when they really do, like this year with this Trump administration, Canadians are more engaged in news than I've seen in many, many years, because it really does matter. And you can be a part of helping them navigate and understand what's happening to them. That's really meaningful, rewarding work, and you just keep your journalists focused on that.
I'm just keeping track of the time. It's 7:20, and if you have questions, I think there's a process for how to get them, and I'll ask the panelists afterwards. I wanted to kind of move forward to talk again about the election, but this time to talk about the importance of local news. We know that an issue that impacts Calgary, Alberta, may not be felt the same way as in London, Ontario, but local news is disappearing. I just wanted to read this passage from reporting that was done in the Walrus this past February. Since 2008, 529 outlets have closed, local outlets have closed in 351 communities across Canada. Only about half as many have launched and survived. Community newspapers account for about 3/4 of all the closings to date. But the blight is spreading to, sorry, this is really bad practice, you should have been on the same page. It's spreading to the broadcast sector. 10 of the 43 radio stations that have shut down since 2008 closed in the past 20 months. What impact does the disappearance of local news have on journalism as a whole?
Let me take this one first, because I think there is, I want to talk for a second about the why before we talk about the what. Mm-hmm. Because I think it's absolutely critical that everybody understand the why that this is happening. And there's two component parts to it, certainly from my perspective. The first component part is the manner by which people consume news has changed radically. It used to be done by appointment with either the morning newspaper or with supper time and late television news broadcasts, radio newscasts, like, I grew up listening to the CBC's The World at 8. I wouldn't leave for school in the morning until I heard The World at 8. But people do not consume news that way anymore. It's available 24/7 instantly. So that is one component that is impacting, the number of media outlets. The other, and this is the business side of the business, and that is advertisers have had no other choice but to redirect dollars into the digital space. And the first redirection occurred in and around launching their own websites and maintaining their own websites. That was probably 15 or more years ago. The next phase was that they needed to have staff to populate their own social media feeds. And now they are finding that they need to be advertising in the digital social media space. Advertising dollars are finite. And what has transpired during what I just described is a massive gravitation of advertising away from traditional media to digital. And the consequences of that have been staggering, and we've had to make very, very difficult decisions with respect to cutting staff size, and in some cases canceling programs, and in others shutting down operations outright. But again, being somebody who worked in local markets for the better part of my career, I also think we have to do a reality check. There was a big hue and cry about when Bell Media canceled noon hour newscasts on television in every market across the country except for Toronto. The reality of noon hour newscasts was there was very little new material in those shows. Many radio stations have not mounted newscasts across this country for years and years. So our business is evolving. It is changing radically. Now, all that to not say that local news is unimportant or less important than it used to be. Certainly from my perspective, it's as important as it has ever been. But I tend to believe that it is the storytelling that is most critical. It's not the existence of a outlet. It's not the existence of a program. It is telling Canadian stories in every corner of this country and endeavoring to make sure that those stories are consumed to the greatest extent possible.
But can stories, because I know we were backstage and you were talking about the election and how you had regional reporters, because I think sometimes the concern is that for smaller communities, if they don't have a presence, a local news outlet, maybe if someone flies in and tells that story, they get the story wrong. So why did you approach covering the election from a regional point of view?
So what we did during our main election night broadcast was that we chose to have 6 of our local anchors tell the story of what was happening in their particular region from a riding by riding, vote by vote perspective. And we went from one to the next, to the next, to the next, until we got from Atlantic Canada to Vancouver. Why did we do that? I consider local news to be the backbone of CTV News. We have very strong local news operations in virtually every market from coast to coast. Many of them are the most watched in their community, have been for years. Those teams do great work, and it has never been showcased on the national news level at CTV. At least it hasn't been for a very, very long time. So we chose to make that a key component part of our program.
Unless somebody else wants to say something, we have a ton of questions from the audience. So I'd like to get to them. But I just had one more final question, because we can't talk about local news, but I want to talk about local news on an international stage. We can't talk about it without talking about what happened in Gaza. Foreign journalists haven't been able to enter, and local journalists in Gaza have been telling that story. As of this past January, the Committee to Protect Journalists put the death toll of those journalists at 167, which is devastating to our profession. Earlier on in the conflict, journalists signed a petition to be allowed in. This included journalists from the UK's BBC, ITV, Channel 4, and Sky News, and the US outlets ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC. In your view, what impact does this have on how the war in Gaza was reported and what was reported by not allowing foreign media in?
I think I'll take that one. I spent years as a foreign correspondent myself. I was actually based in Jerusalem for 3 years, based in other places in the Middle East, and so that's sort of how I came up as a journalist. I never spent time in Timmins.
You should say thank you.
I did spend time in Gaza.
Nothing against Timmins, but it's cold during the winter.
I think that, I think that that's tremendously sad that so many journalists, Palestinian journalists, lost their lives, and I think it's admirable that that the petition was signed. I don't think it made one bit of difference in terms of the access that foreign journalists got to Gaza, because it was tightly controlled, hermetically sealed, in fact, I think, to media by the IDF, by the Israelis, and I think that we all have for years worked with Palestinian journalists. We work with journalists all over the world on a regular basis, even if sort of our foreign correspondents are not there on the ground themselves. We have fixers, we have drivers, we have staff who really do incredible work, I think, paving the way for our news gathering, for telling the stories, helping tell the stories about what's happening where they live. But to paint a little bit of a picture, with the recent story in Gaza, we were heavily reliant on our Palestinian colleagues to help gather footage, to help gather news, and then feed that to us so that we could weave that content into our stories. We were able to get journalists into Israel, and I think I'm actually quite proud of the coverage that we did out of the Middle East during that time. But our Palestinian colleague, who was out there gathering news every day, was having his was under sort of constant worry that his house was going to be bombed. In fact, I think it was damaged at one point. He was worried about his family. He was worried about his neighbors, and so to have the ability as a foreign correspondent, I mean, this is sort of part of the reason why it's so important to have people come into a context, come into a story, to be able to cover it and to be able to do it without that, I think, personal, without those sort of personal aspects which inevitably affect people who are actually living the story. it's very difficult. So I would say that about the impact that that our lack of access has, not just to Gaza, but to other places as well.
So we
Can
have.
I just
Of
quickly
course you
add to
can.
that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think a key point is that technology is a wonderful thing. I mean, the manner by which we can tap into what is happening on the ground now through local populations who are carrying effectively a news camera with them everywhere they go is radically different than certainly when I began in this business. And I'm gonna show my age yet again. When I first started in Timmins, video was delivered via a plastic bag that you drove to the airport or took to the bus station and threw on the bus, threw on a plane in hopes that it would get to the national newsroom or to our news
And you never checked
epicenter.
it just in case it got lost.
Well, but that's the way that it happened, and now it's truly amazing. Critically important for us to be in the Middle East, yes, but we're not necessarily missing everything by not having the access there that we might like.
I did want to talk about citizen journalism, but we don't have enough time. How much time do we have? Sorry. 10 minutes, okay. I'll try to get through as many questions. So the first audience question, it doesn't have a name, but if it's your question, thank you so much for it. The question is, in today's fragmented media landscape, where audiences experience news on timelines decided by algorithms, community journalists, and short-form stories, cut for social consumption. Sorry, my eyes are really bad. This is 40. What do you think is the role of the traditional news anchor moving forward? Is the era of the news anchor over? Who would like to take that?
I'd just like to make one quick point, because everyone's social feeds are different, but what I find kind of striking is all of those people, all of those kinds of types of social content that you mentioned all feature traditional news anchors. I mean, most people just cut the little bits from Fox or from CNN or from our stations and comment on them. So it still plays a huge role in social. I know it feels more like it's more direct, but at the end of the day, they're not really news gathering. They're just working off of.
Okay, maybe
programs
let's build on that question.
Sure.
This other question says, some young people prefer to go to platforms like YouTube's Twitch because they feel those content creators are more authentic than some stoic news anchors. How can broadcast journalism evolve to also engage those audiences while remaining true and fact-based?
How to take that? That's true. I mean, the traditional anchor works for an audience that's in their late 50s, 60s, 70s, and will continue to. There is some artifice of television news that doesn't work for younger generations for sure. But the through line for all ages is that personality does matter. Actually, people build relationship with somebody. So I think about for our audiences on YouTube, we built a show with actually one of our anchors from the National who left the National.
About that?
Andrew Chang does a show called About That. Mm-hmm. And that was totally different, and took off the suit and wears a hoodie and but does great in-depth explainer journalism, but a different style, still highly produced and highly polished. And it works for a different audience. So there is a way to do it. But you have to, the problem for all of us is that we have all of these audiences to serve, and they have distinct needs, and they're on distinct platforms. And so you're really in this position of always trying to figure out how much do you put over here, and how do you put your attention over there, and build an audience that's looking for something different. Because it is true. My kids will never watch, an hour of television news. They just won't. But they'll watch something they're interested in for hours, and it's two guys on a microphone.
Talking about
something they care about. Yeah, it's Magic the Gathering. I don't know if you know that, but so anyway, all to say, we are certainly trying all kinds of different experiments to meet those audiences. Everything from TikTok, YouTube, and more.
This question is from Karina. Thank you so much. One of his campaign stops CPC leader referred to Judy Trinh as a protester when she was trying to ask a follow-up question. Thoughts? How do you feel about political parties imposing limits on how many questions each reporter can ask? Who would like to take that? Next question.
No, I mean, I guess I should. Judy Trinh belongs to me. Belongs to our organization. It comes back to what I said earlier. We have to disavow ourselves of the notion that politicians are obligated to talk to us. And what we need to try to do is impress upon them that they should want to talk to us. And this, I think is a particularly we're at a crossroads. We're at a particularly trying time for our parliamentary press gallery members who have had great relationships with for years the politicians on Parliament Hill. They rightly so, because of those relationships, believe that politicians should be obligated to talk to us, but they're not anymore, because they can go so many other places and get their message out.
Anyone else want to say anything? Okay. During the pandemic, it became hard to tell the news channels apart. It felt like one station finished the other station's sentences. What are you doing post-pandemic to create distinct personas / approaches to each of your brands, or do you want to differentiate? Can you also comment on your fact checkers' practices to prevent misinformation? John?
Sure. I guess I'll approach it a little bit differently. It's a great question, because it's not just the pandemic. It's something that we've talked about. I mean, I've got an amazing newsroom with amazing people who can tell amazing stories. They often have their own stories and their unique stories, but for sure, half of what they do are the same stories that are done by the other three networks represented up here. So it's an excellent, I don't know the answer, but it's an excellent question. At a time of shrinking resources, so many of our resources are put onto the same story, and in many cases, taking out original journalism, which is fabulous, and we all have great people that do original journalism, it is the same story. So there's been experiments in the US over the years with common assignment desks for just news that happens, pooling cameras, trying to create a system where you can reduce the amount of resource required to cover the things that need to get covered, to free up resource for each individual station to do more original reporting. Mm-hmm. We've had over the years some of those conversations, like at a very kind of like early part of the conversation. It never goes anywhere, but I think it's worth thinking about. It's a great question, and I think about it a lot. It's just like, again, I've got fabulous people that do fabulous work, but they're what we all do, and in some cases they're doing the same work.
And our story selection choices are driven by what we expect our audience is looking for. Like, it's not a great conspiracy. We don't exchange lists every morning and agree on the top 10 stories. That's just not the way that it works, right? We're our newscasts look very similar because we are applying a Canadian audience's lens to it.
We've got 5 minutes left. How much collaboration is there between traditional news media companies and news influencers? How much potential is there in this? So you want to take this, because you actually went down a news influencer rabbit hole.
So I was fascinated by these White House press conferences, really since the beginning of this administration, this these sort of dedicated press conferences now that they have for social media influencers, which I had heard about, but I hadn't actually watched. So I spent like a fair bit of time today watching some of these questions, and so one of them I had to write down, because this is something that I think has come up a lot in this discussion, which is, what is the difference between a journalist and a social media influencer? And so one of the questions that was asked by a social media influencer, I think her name was Deborah, was incredible, such that I wrote it down. And so this is the question that was put in one of these press conferences. Congratulations on 100 incredible days. And over the first 100 days, the majority of policies we've seen from the Trump administration has been targeted at foreign affairs, such as bringing American hostages home, or attempting to end the war between Ukraine and Russia, or on long-term goals, such as cutting government spending. So there's no question, just so you're all following yet. This is the question. What policies can we expect to see rolled out over the next few months that Americans will directly feel the effects of in order to secure the 2026 midterms for the Republican Party and keep Trump's approval rating historically high? That's the question. So, there is a difference here. I think that most people, again, and I think this point was made earlier, but I don't think that audiences are stupid. I think that people know the difference between that kind of a question and the question that a professional journalist would ask at a press conference. So
What about a Joe Rogan character? I was talking to a friend, and they said that I listen to the podcast because he has great guests, and he does have great guests. But he asks questions, and he says things that journalists could not. And sometimes I've heard conversations of him being compared to other journalists. He's not operating within the same parameters. So how do you think that most people understand the difference between what he's doing versus the limitations and also the boundaries that journalists operate under? Brodie?
I think they do, but they're happy with those differences and enjoy. I mean, there is something there that Joe Rogan is interesting to people, and I'm not sure everyone understands actually what goes behind the standards that we live by, and why we have those standards. And maybe we hope too much that people just get it and understand that the work shows what's behind it. So, and by the way, those kind of questions is why there was such a furor over Rebel Media and their questions at the after the French language leaders debate, because they were similarly worded questions that just come from basically a point of view that is all about really a partisan perspective. I do think people know that, but I also think they enjoy that. And I think the one worry I've had actually through this campaign is what we believe is the right approach is being questioned more and more by people who are looking for those kinds of questions that Sonia just read. There are people who look for their own worldview to be mirrored in the journalism. I've received a number of complaints. Actually, on the way here, I had an email from somebody saying they're organizing a campaign, and there's a meeting to complain about our journalists who are sort of our senior political correspondents, because they were so pro-Poilievre and trying to tank Carney's campaign. And this is the same day that the National Post just ran a piece about how we were cheering the election of Carney in our coverage by those same correspondents. So, I mean, but that's the reality. That's every day I get emails like that where people are seeing completely different things, but questioning the journalism. The simple question that you mentioned that show we did on Cross Country Checkup. There was a lot of anger about a question. It was badly worded, but that question was enough for many people to say the show should be canceled and everyone fired. And I worry a little bit about that inclination to go, I don't like this question, so I think it all has to be shut down. And I heard that from some pretty prominent free speech absolutists, but they were so outraged because there's a lot of emotion baked in the moment we're living in.
I'm gonna, Jenny, can I just get 2 minutes? I want to give them 30 seconds each to just any final thoughts. Is that okay? Thanks. John, final thoughts.
Sure, yeah. I guess just in thinking back for the last hour and a half, and Brodie alluded to this earlier in terms of this is a great business to be in. So just to make that point, we have challenges. We think about things like the pandemic, mistakes we make. We think about how to fix those mistakes. We get a lot of complaints all day, all night from people. We try to answer them. But there's a positive side of this work. It's extremely rewarding. We're extremely privileged to be in this position. At Rogers, we're growing local news, so we're expanding. There's no money in it, but the company is committed to it, which is fabulous for all of us. We're building new platforms in new cities. So it felt a little negative, and there are a lot of negative things about the work we do. But at the core of it, people have passion for it. The ones that we can bring in, for the most part, love it, and we're very excited about the future.
Yeah, I would want to, I think, echo on a positive note. So these challenges exist, and I think that we are all dealing with them in our own way. And to be clear also, all of our organizations are quite different from each other. So while we're all up here, and we're all fairly friendly with each other, I think, most days, we do have, I think, different challenges, and different business models, and some of the challenges are the same. But I would say that on a positive note, when I think about global news and what we're accomplishing, I'm seeing a lot of interest, frankly, in news. We've been able to grow our linear broadcast news 12% year over year. On digital, that's 18% year over year, and that's significant. And that shows that audience cares about news. Now, some of that audience may be watching us and saying, "Well, I don't trust that Donna Friesen, and I don't believe a word of what she's saying." But they're still watching us. And so I take heart in that. I take heart in the journalists who every single day go out there and try to do the best job they can to tell the stories that they think are important to this country. And I also take heart in the fact that we all think about these things. We all talk about these things. We all worry about these things. Jeff Semple, who I was talking to earlier today, was describing how, many nights he stays up thinking, did I get this right? Did I, and that is, probably unfortunate for his family, but it's very lucky that we have people like that in our business. And so I choose to take a positive outlook on journalism, and I think that we will continue to just try to do better and to build on that success.
And Richard?
I feel very similarly. This is a great business to be in, and I hope that any of you who are here tonight don't walk away discouraged by it. There is, I think, forever going to be a demand for great storytelling and the reflection of our communities back to themselves. And I'm going to apologize mostly to Brodie because he's heard me tell this story before. I was in journalism school when the CBC closed 10 local stations. I was told in class that night that I and my classmates, in all likelihood, would never be able to get a job in our chosen field. And I've enjoyed a almost 35-year-long career in the business despite that. And I repeat that story often as a ray of light, I hope, for people who want to do what all of us do, and who are committed to telling great Canadian stories and as I said, reflecting our communities back to themselves.
Well, I'll end by saying I'm very proud of our work. I think we do a great job, and I think we still always have to look in the mirror and think there are a number of people who think we don't get them or don't reflect their views or perspectives well enough. And I'm thinking a lot about going into this post-election year of how do we do better at getting more people to feel, in the case of CBC, that we could be their public broadcaster as well. So you always have to balance the work that is really good, but also with the humility that we get things wrong and we miss perspectives and we miss views and people and communities, and so I think that's where my mind is right now. Is I want to push ourselves to get out and just listen more rather than talk and tell people.
Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you all for being here.